Good evening. It's been so long, I don't even know how to behave. So when I say welcome back, it has special meaning because it's been 18 months since we've had a chance to get together in a room and share an event, not over Zoom. And so we're really, really grateful to be here and grateful to see everyone and students and friends from the community, and we hope it's the beginning of a great year at the IOP. I'm David Axelrod, by the way, the director of the IOP. And there couldn't be a more appropriate first event. We are all about democracy, making democracy work better, and there's nothing more fundamental to that than the vote. And access to the vote, free and fair elections, and all of that is up for debate today. It also happens to be National Voter Registration Day, so a very appropriate day to have this discussion. And two of our students from You Shy Votes, which is a student-led organization that is committed to registering voters on campus, will formally introduce our panel, our splendid panel and moderator, in a few minutes. You may have seen tables here at the event as you walked in this evening. You Shy Votes is a nonpartisan voter engagement group founded out of the IOP to boost voter turnout and engagement on the University of Chicago campus. And if you aren't already registered to vote, please do that tonight after the event. Hopefully this discussion will inspire you in that way. Just a few announcements. Next Monday night, October 4th, we will be examining how 9/11 changed America and the world in a panel discussion moderated by Evan Osnos of The New Yorker. And he will be in conversation with Ben Rhodes, who was a senior foreign policy advisor to President Barack Obama, Farah Pandith, the adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and a former diplomat, and Michael Morell, the former acting director of the CIA and a board member of the IOP. And then on Tuesday, October 5th, I'll be moderating a conversation with Washington Post political reporter Robert Costa, who is the co-author with Bob Woodward of the, you may have heard about this book, Peril, and examining the tumultuous period in the transfer of power between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. That will be a live taping of my podcast, The Axe Files, and there'll be Q&A to follow. And next Friday, join us for lunch with Lauren Baer, a nationally recognized civic leader who will share her personal story of running for Congress as a staunch advocate for LGBTQ plus rights and serving as a senior advisor in the State Department. This event will be hosted in partnership with the Spectrum LGBTQ Plus Alliance, a student-led civic organization program at the IOP. To learn more about all our upcoming events, please visit our website at politics.uchicago.edu and sign up for our newsletter. I have an exciting pleasure of introducing our new executive director, Zinat Rahman. So happy to have her here, and you'll be hearing a lot from her in the weeks and months to come. While she's relatively new in this role, she's not new to this campus. She's not new to this city. She is a native Chicagoan. She received a master's degree in Middle East Studies from U Chicago and was an IOP fellow in 2015. She came to the IOP from the Aspen Institute, where she was the director of the Inclusive America Project. She previously served as at the U.S. Department of State as a special advisor on global youth issues to both Secretaries Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, and as acting director of the Center for Faith-Based and Community Initiatives at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and as director of policy at Interfaith Youth Corps. So she comes with a splendid background, and she's been here for a few months, a joy to work with, as you all will learn. So say hello to Zinat. Couple of other housekeeping issues. We will be doing Q&A as usual after this panel. We'll open the floor to take questions from you in the audience. Please line up to ask your question. There'll be a microphone, in the center aisle? In the side aisle? On the side aisles? In that aisle? Anyway, look for the microphone. I just want to encourage anyone who has a question to come forward. If you're a first year, do not be hesitant. Take advantage of this opportunity and all the opportunities that we offer here. Q&A is a cornerstone of our events here. As usual, we'll give priority for the first questions to our students. I propose that we alternate male and female questioners at the microphone, but you guys work that out. And make sure your phones are on silent. There are restrooms downstairs, which may be the most important announcement of the evening. We'll now hear formal introductions of our panelists and moderator from Donna Sun and Hamza Jilani, who are both leaders of the USHI USHI Votes program. Hamza's a second year in the college, majoring in political science and economics. He's co-director of the voting ambassador team at USHI Votes. Donna's a third year in the college, majoring in political science and French, and she's a member of the organizing leadership team for USHI Votes. Please join me in welcoming Donna and Hamza to the podium.
All right, thank you for the introduction, David. Like David said, my name is Donna. He's already done my introduction for me, so I'm not going to bore you with another repetition of that. But I am going to quickly plug USHI Votes. Our table is over there. Like David said earlier, we are a student-led, nonpartisan voter engagement initiative founded out of the Institute of Politics to boost voter turnout and engagement on the UChicago campus. Our goal is to be the #1 voting campus in the country, and you can learn more about how you can register to vote at the USHI Votes table all the way over to your right.
And hi everyone, I'm Hamza. I'm a second year, and I'm the voter engagement chair on the student advisory board, as well as the voting ambassador team co-director at USHI Votes.
So our panel topic today is on voting rights, a relevant topic given that today is National Voter Registration Day. But that aside, the topic has been in the news quite a bit since the 2020 general elections and the 2021 Georgia runoff elections, especially as voting access issues in historically marginalized communities have become more prominent in recent months. So given how critical voting is to our democracy, we are honored to welcome the following speakers for this evening's discussion.
So first, our moderator, Ested Herndon, is moderating our discussion on voting rights today. He is a New York Times political reporter and CNN political analyst. He was an integral part of the New York Times' reporting team for the 2020 presidential election. Next, our panelists. Ron Brownstein is an American journalist, political correspondent, and analyst at The Atlantic and CNN. He's the author of 6 books and is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize finalist for his coverage of presidential campaigns. And Sean Morales-Doyle is the acting director of the Democracy Program at the Brennan Center for Justice, doing advocacy work to authorize automatic voter registration and enact voting rights restoration. He also litigates civil rights and constitutional issues.
And last but definitely not least, Nsé Ufot is an activist, community organizer, and the CEO of the New Georgia Project, a voter support and legal action nonprofit organization founded by Stacey Abrams in 2013. Leading up to the January 2021 congressional runoff election, Ufot and her volunteers registered nearly 7,000 people in the 30 days following the November general election. So with all that being said, please join us in welcoming our guests.
Thank you so much for having us. I appreciate the students for the introduction, and also to David for having us all here. I'm really excited about this I should also just say that like a true millennial, I did not print my questions out, but wrote them on my phone. I promise you I'm not texting. But let's just jump straight into it. I have a couple questions that I want to kick off to start with all three, and then some that go to each of you individually based on the work that I know y'all do. The first is kind of gimmicky, but in the same way of like a State of the Union-esque topic sentence that we get from the president every year, I would like you all to give me that. What is the state of democracy? The state of our democracy is blank. Let's start with Ron.
I would say we are facing the greatest threat to our underlying constitutional order and our basic democratic structure since the Civil War.
So I take it that's not strong.
Strongly imperiled.
Insa?
I'll say this, that we are rapidly approaching a multilingual, multiracial, multi-generational, progressive majority in this country, and that there's a pale, male, stale minority that is terrified about it, and they're doing everything in their power to fight the future. It's not possible. And if anyone has had a coworker that's about to get fired, or someone that's a partner that was about to get dumped, you know that like when they know that they're on their way out the door and they start like stealing office supplies and behaving really badly because the end is nigh, that's what we are experiencing, that's what we're living through in this moment.
Tom?
I think I would take both of those and agree. I think we are at a moment right now where we are seeing threats to our democracy like we've never seen before, unprecedented attacks on voting rights, unprecedented attempts to undermine the very system of democracy. But at the same time, we are seeing more engagement on these issues by people across the political spectrum than we've maybe ever seen before. People care about voting rights. It is a top-level political issue for people on both sides of the aisle. And so just as we're seeing many attempts by many states to restrict access to voting, we're actually seeing just as many, actually more laws expanding access to democracy in a whole bunch of the other states of this country, and we see it as a top-level priority in Congress right now. Whether they actually do anything about it is a different question. But so it is, I think, we are seeing unprecedented attacks, but a pushback also, push for the type of democracy in the future that NSA is talking about like we've never seen before.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think comes up with this issue is where do we kind of start, right? Oftentimes when we talk about voting rights, there's, folks will talk about January 6th, they'll talk about the former president. Where do you think is the original sin of how we got to this point? Ron, you said democracy's in peril. Where did that start?
Really good question. First of all, by the way, thank you I'm sorry I can't be there with you all in person, and thanks for allowing me to kind of zoom in here. Look, I mean, I think, I'm going to offer a similar frame and say, I mean, I think that the core dynamic we are dealing with is that the Republican Party is looking for ways to maintain majority power in a country where they no longer represent the majority of the population. They've lost the popular vote in 7 out of the past 8 presidential elections. It's never happened in American history since the formation of the modern party system. And they are, even with some improvement in 2020 among people of color, they are facing demographic trends that worry them in a whole series of states, particularly across the Sun Belt. Now, I mean, there have been issues about access to voting for many years, but I guess I would place the modern kind of wave that we are living through appropriately, because it really is the point at which this sort of demographic anxiety crystallized and fused with a desire to make it tougher to vote. I would place it back to the Tea Party election in 2010. I mean, after the Tea Party election sweep of 2010, is when you saw the first wave of efforts in red states in a variety of ways, at that point focused more on voter ID and other efforts to make it tougher to vote, followed very quickly by the 2013 Supreme Court decision in Shelby County, which has to be seen as the turning point, and also one of the most incorrect predictions ever. And I will defer to Sean on this maybe, but when John Roberts wrote, John Roberts, the Chief Justice, in the Shelby County decision in 2013, essentially that discrimination in voting was a thing of the past. And thus, basically eviscerated Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, eliminating preclearance, and that was kind of the starting gun for what we have seen, which then accelerated under Trump, and strikingly has gone to a whole new level since Trump's defeat. And all of these laws that are passing in red states, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, more, really have to be seen as only one prong of a kind of multi-pronged effort. As we've seen in Georgia, Republicans are trying to increase political control over the counting and the administration of the vote. You are seeing kind of 2020 election deniers running for Secretary of State and other election positions. There's a whole series of steps that are underway to both suppress access to the ballot box, but also make it easier potentially to subvert the result in 2024. And it is, as Sean said, an open question whether Democrats are going to use the one lever they have available to them, which is their control of the Congress and the White House, to try to pass a federal legislation that would counteract these trends, or whether they are willing, in effect, to give Senate Republicans a veto and to run air cover for this kind of ground offensive that's going on in the red states.
Give it to me. Does that story start in 2012? Do you think that's the origin?
Absolutely not. Hi, Ron.
Hey.
So I would flip the framing quite a little bit, that it is a lie that everyone has always had access to the franchise, right, in this country. That in fact, if you were not white, if you did not own property, if you did not have a penis, right, then you did not have the right to vote originally. And that the history of voting in this country, in fact, has been a constant battle to expand the definition of citizen, to expand who has access to the franchise, right? That we're talking about, so we did these cool videos in 2020 celebrating the centennial of the 19th Amendment, right? But even then, we had to have an asterisk, right? That it was white women that got the right to vote, right? That it would be another 45 years of organizing when the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, that it expanded the right to vote to women of color in this country. And so I would say that it's been a centuries-long endeavor to expand the definition of citizen, to expand who has access to the right to vote and who has access to the franchise. And often when we make leaps or we make progress, that it is then responded, or there is a corresponding backlash that we then have to organize against and build on top of as well. And so you get to pick and choose. You can say 2012, you can say 1965, right? You can say, there are key dates. You can say 2021, right? January 6th. That there are key dates where we have seen sort of bright spots and corresponding like valleys, dark days, when America or American leaders have succumbed to their worst instincts and attacked our democracy or shrunk access to participation as a way, as Ron Brownstein said, to hold on to power.
Sean, we know that there in the Constitution is provisions to stop the infringement of voting access. There's not that affirmative right to vote for everyone in there. How then should we see our democracy? Is it something that has been there and stable or written in, or is it, as she is laying out, a franchise that has only been marginally expanded and fairly only recently to all?
I think absolutely when the country was founded, that there were a lot of really bold words put on paper that we were not living up to at the moment. And so to talk about our democracy back then when, as Nsé said, it was a very small group of white men that were allowed to vote, was, we weren't living up to that ideal of democracy, and we still don't live up to the ideal. We've been working towards that for a very long time. The Constitution doesn't have those explicit words of there is a right to vote, but it does acknowledge the right to vote in a number of different ways, and the Reconstruction Amendments made very clear that there was a right to vote and that you couldn't discriminate on the basis of race. But it took 100 years before the Voting Rights Act actually made that promise somewhat more real for a huge segment of the population. And I think when the Voting Rights Act passed, Congress knew that they were going to face these renewed attempts and new creative ways to engage in discrimination and to stop people from voting. That's why they designed the Voting Rights Act the way they did. Section 2, we hear about Section 5, which is what the Supreme Court essentially gutted in 2013, which required states with a history of discrimination to run their changes in their voting policies by the federal government before they could make those changes to ensure they were not discriminatory. But Section 2 was Congress saying, we know they're going to come up with new ways of engaging in this discrimination. It's not just going to be the literacy tests we've seen before. It's not just going to be the poll taxes we've seen before. There will be new ways of doing this. And so we're going to allow people to sue based on any future denial or abridgment of the right to vote. And what happened, I think Ron's right to point to a turning point. I agree, absolutely, this is a long story. But there was a turning point in around 2010 where there was a new version of that. We keep seeing new ways of getting at the right to vote, but we saw a shift there, and a very intentional shift of the rhetoric used to justify these policies where we have this new myth of voter fraud that everyone's pointing to justify them. But the Supreme Court made this decision in 2013, but there was actually an earlier decision that we called NMUDNO, the Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District #1, I think, which is the Supreme Court forecasting that it might do what it's going to do in Shelby County, and it signaled to people that they could start this new wave. And then the Supreme Court basically went and did what they said they might do in 2013, and everyone knew what was happening then. That's the famous line from the dissent in the Shelby County decision, is saying that we've gotten rid of, we're not seeing any race discrimination right now, so we can get rid of preclearance, is like throwing away your umbrella during a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. And that was prophetic, though it wasn't, it was fairly obvious that was going to happen. And when John Roberts is pointing to this gap closing during 2008 and 2012 elections, when of course Barack Obama is on the ticket, between voters of color and white voters, the turnout gap was closing. And then for the next decade, it's just widened back again. So while we've seen, record turnout in the last year, we see not just a gap in racial turnout, but a widening gap in racial turnout. And all of this was to be expected because, as Nsé said, this is a long story. It's the same thing over and over again. The rhetoric shifts a little bit to respond to the legal protections. And then unfortunately, recently, the legal protections get tossed to the side by our Supreme Court, and that's why we are where we are now.
Mm-hmm. He mentions we know after Shelby County, we saw a number of states act immediately. I'm always struck in our reporting how when I go to the South, specifically on these, it's I told you so every single time. What do as someone who was working in Georgia, I remember, talking to you about this stuff during the runoffs. What does the South and Georgia have to teach America about voting rights?
Oh, what is it that no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent issues? That's definitely a lesson there. Hey, Joe Biden.
Did you all see it coming before?
Yeah, absolutely. I think also that I would say that white supremacy and voter suppression and its cousins, right, sexism and xenophobia, are becoming more sophisticated. And that when people often talk about like voter suppression, I think that images of, and you've probably heard me say this before, that it conjures in some people's minds like images of Bubba on the back of a pickup truck, right, with a shotgun, trying to intimidate black voters. But in fact, it has become much more sophisticated. And we refer to it as like James Crow data scientist, James Crow,
I have not heard
PhD.
that. I like that. I like that.
PhD, and that you can have a race-neutral approach that still renders the same outcomes and still makes it more difficult for poor people and rural folks and young people and people of color to vote and participate in our elections. And so I think that the lessons that we are learning is that modern problems require modern solutions. And so we have met the increased sophistication in voter suppression tactics with our own increased sophistication in our civil rights and voting rights organizing, right? Which is why we definitely still are in church basements and in housing projects and on college campuses, that we go to homecomings and we table at National Voter Registration Day, but we also build video games, right? That we have a super well attended Twitch channel, that we have a team of digital organizers that are constantly monitoring for misinformation and disinformation and working to inject truth about elections and voting into those conversations and inject truth about the vaccine, et cetera. But yeah, that it is our responsibility, it is our duty to meet, again, this more sophisticated James Crow, PhD, with our own sophistication. I think that those are the lessons.
Ron, you mentioned when you were talking about the kind of state of play politically, how the Republican Party has sought to kind of make itself a majority through a minority of voters, and that falls along those racial lines. Is it that one-to-one to you that we are seeing these attempts at democracy, interference or subversion or suppression because the racial demographics of the country is changing? Do you think that is a causational thing?
Yeah, I think the short answer is yes. I mean, I don't think history is going to have any trouble kind of assessing the primary impetus of the entire Trump emergence and Trump movement, of which this voter suppression, is one part. And it is, I think, fundamentally a reaction among the voters who are the most uneasy about the way the country is changing demographically, culturally, and even economically. I've called this, since 2012, I've been calling this the coalition of restoration, as opposed to Democrats relying mostly on the places and people who are generally more comfortable with the way the country is changing, a coalition of transformation. And that's why I think, as I said, obviously the right to vote has been contested ground through our history, and we have been, the struggle to kind of expand the circle of inclusion is unending. But I do think we are clearly in a new phase or stage of that struggle that dates back to the backlash against Obama's victory, because his presence in the White House was a daily reminder to the voters who don't like the way the country is changing, that it in fact, it wasn't kind of Robert Young and Donna Reed anymore. I mean, there was a different America that was emerging. And if you look at this, at many of the states, not all, obviously there's Iowa and Montana, but many of the states, Georgia, Texas, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, where there has been the most significant efforts to make it tougher to vote. One thing they have in common is what Bill Fry has called the cultural generation gap. I mean, those are states, what I've called the brown and the gray. Those are states where 2/3, 3/4, 4/5 of the senior population is still white. Those older white voters are the backbone of the Republican coalition that is still dominant in those states. But if you look at kind of the emerging generations, the under 18 population, they are majority non-white in all of those states except North Carolina, where they're 45%. And so I look at what's happening very clearly as an attempt to kind of stack sandbags against a rising tide of demographic change, and to make it harder for this emerging coalition to accumulate political power commensurate with its numbers. And that, I think, is the fundamental dynamic that we are living through. Yeah.
In my own reporting, I feel I always tell a story that when I go to Trump rallies and talk to people about why, where this origin was, the thing that comes up more than I often imagine was the Henry Louis Gates moment of the Obama presidency, of these moments where there was that kind of racial myth was busted early. And you had a lot of folks who I have met on the road who started in one place in 2008, but by 2012 and 2016, as you're mentioning, had made that kind of reactionary change. Sean, you mentioned states. What have we seen on the state level in the legislatures since particularly President Trump has contested the results of the 2020 election? Have we seen legislatures support those claims? And I know that's true in some of those red states, but we've also seen some blue states, as you've mentioned, kind of move in the opposite direction to expand voting rights. Is there one side that's more dominant than the other?
So I do want to say, just to quickly pick up on something Ron said, I like the frame for this conversation, but I want to, and so I want to note that and highlight something that I think a lot of times when we talk about these bills, we talk about them in partisan terms, and we talk about them as one party trying to hold on to power, and Ron said that, but he's also we're all focusing on the fact that I think sometimes we give politicians a pass when we suggest that what they're doing is just about partisan politics and not about race. And so tying those two things together when they are actually tied together, I think is really important. It isn't just about trying to hold on to power for one party. It is actually about the fact that in many parts of this country, racial politics and party politics line up with one another. And it is actually about fear of the other. It's about that xenophobia. Mm-hmm. It's not just about, I want my party to win. It's about who's in that other party. And what we're seeing right now in the states are these divergent trends. One, I wouldn't say is more dominant than the other. If anything, we track every piece of legislation, voting rights legislation introduced in every state legislature across the country at the Brennan Center every year. We've been doing it for over a decade, and we have seen more bills restricting access to the vote this year than ever before. We have also seen more bills expanding access to the right to vote than ever before, and there have actually been far more bills expanding access, both introduced and passed. But I don't know that you could say that's the dominant trend, because there's almost an incomplete separation between the states that are doing these two things, and so just going by the number of bills doesn't really help you. If you look at the number of states, the last time we came out with a roundup of these laws in July, 18 states had passed 33 laws restricting access to the right to vote. And so, that's almost half the country that is moving in that direction, and then there's about half the country moving the other direction, which is really troubling because increasingly that means that your right to vote is dependent on where you live in the country, which should not be the case, obviously. But it is also troubling to see that, as we've been talking about, perhaps James Crow has figured out a lot of new ways to engage in voter suppression, and so these bills that we're seeing now are different than ones we've seen in the past. They're not just the voter ID laws from 10 years ago. They're new and creative and sometimes frightening ways to go after our democracy. Things like passing new criminal laws that criminalize legitimate behavior by elections officials, by poll workers, by voter engagement organizations that are trying to stifle and chill people who are trying to help voters. So they've already done everything to stop voters. Now they're trying to restrict the people that help voters and that make our democracy work. And they're coming up with new ways to do this. The Texas bill that passed is full of these new approaches, because Texas already had this incredibly restrictive system that made it hard to vote. And so now they've made it a crime for election administrators in Texas, for county election officials, to solicit mail ballot applications. So they can't tell people, hey, if you're eligible to vote by mail, get your mail ballot application in. Not only can they not do it, it's actually a crime for them to do that in Texas. It is a crime to pay somebody to help voters who have disabilities or limited English proficiency or limited literacy in Texas now. So if you have an organization that wants to help voters vote who can't read the ballot that they have in front of them, you can't pay your employees to do that. That would be a criminal offense in Texas. It is now a crime for a poll worker to make a partisan poll watcher's observation not reasonably effective, whatever that means. They are putting these crimes on the books, and this is a new way of stopping people from helping voters and ultimately stopping voters from voting. And so it's not just comparing the numbers. We have these two divergent trends, but it is also that one of these trends is going into new and different territory that we haven't seen before. I will just note very quickly that the other trend is doing that too. We're seeing creative and innovative ways of giving more access to our democracy in these other bills, and that's great to see. We're seeing restoring voting rights to people with convictions in the past. We're seeing automatic voter registration, same-day registration, and we saw some things in Texas, county elections officials doing things never done before last year, and that's actually why we're seeing this bill target those county officials, like 24-hour voting and drive-through voting, and things that made it much easier for people to vote. So we really are seeing sort of, a tale of two nations in terms of the kinds of efforts we see both to make our democracy better and to make it harder for people to vote.
As a follow-up, and this can go to all of you, we know Democrats have prioritized H.R. 1 and H.R. 4 on the federal level as their voting rights priorities.
Do we know that?
Well, that's what they said.
Some
That's what they keep telling me. And so I wanted to hear what, we know that the prospects of passage are slim on these in the current moment. We know that Democrats have 10 other priorities or 10 other controversies that they need to do right now.
They're not gonna pass it.
But would these bills solve the problems that you are talking about?
Many of them. Sorry, and say you want to go?
I mean, it's not a silver bullet, right?
Right, exactly.
But to your point, where you live, the state that you live in, should not determine your access to the ballot. And so setting a federal standard for elections and electoral participation is a pretty good start. For curbing some of the shenanigans that we see based off of the relative strength of the Republican Party and whether or not they have a governing trifecta. And so, yes, absolutely. That, again, it is a step in the right direction, and it's beyond time. Like, there are places, Mississippi doesn't have early voting, right? But in Georgia, there was 45 days of early voting, but because of the partisan attacks by Republicans, it's been cut down to 21, and they're trying to cut it again with Senate Bill 202, et cetera. So Georgia's voting bill, Senate Bill 202, created 5 new voting crimes. 2 of them are felonies, right? And we're talking about, from handing water, yes, to voters in line, which, it's what we do, right? Because they have subjected Georgia voters to standing in 8, 9, 10-hour lines to go vote. So it is the neighborly thing, it's the Southern thing, it's the humanitarian thing to bring a food truck and to bring out bottles of water. Oh, and here's a portable cell phone charger because your phone is dead because you're going on hour 10 that you've been in line to vote. So a federal standard for electoral participation that injects some predictability into how elections are conducted, that sets a budget, I think is absolutely necessary in this moment. And again, there's no such thing as a silver bullet because, humans always find a way to be terrible. And then, it will require us to rise up and say that's not okay and a fix for it, but it is most certainly a start.
Ron, then why haven't we seen this be top of the Democrats' priority list in Washington? Where do they stand with H.R. 1 and 4? And do you think that there's enough urgency on that party to confront the peril that you're talking about?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I wrote in January that whether to end the filibuster to pass some version of H.R. 1 would be the single most important decision Democrats face over these 2 years. And I believe that is even more true now than when I wrote it, given what's happened in the red states. Before I answer that, let me just underline the stakes here to go back to Sean's point about how the red states and blue states are moving in divergent directions on access to the vote. It'd be one thing if that was only a reflection of kind of a separatist impulse on the part of the red states. We want to have different rules about voting the way we have different rules about guns or other issues. But this is not solely about, the laws are not, Republicans are not changing the laws in Georgia and Texas and Florida and Arizona solely so they can continue to control power within those states. I think they are also trying to change the laws in enough states to tilt the national playing field toward them in a way that will make it more difficult for Democrats to control the White House, the Senate, or the House. This is not a defensive kind of maneuver. This is an offensive maneuver, again, along this broader theme of how do you maintain majority control in a country where you have not been able to generate majority support. Democrats, I think, have kind of I think, whiffed on this for most of this year, starting with the White House. I mean, I wrote that piece in May. I think it was the first one in which people in the White House for the first time said, you know, just tell us what the rules are and we can out-organize. You know, we can organize around them. Like, these bills are not that insurmountable. Republicans aren't going to get as much out of them as they expect. And that was a view that infuriated civil rights and voting rights groups, I think, with good reason. Biden, I think, has not fully wanted, more broadly speaking, Biden came into office, I think, hoping to be something like Eisenhower, an elder statesman who was largely above the partisan fray, who was defined by kind of kitchen table, bread and butter issues, and bringing the parties together wherever he could. The offensive against democracy in the red states did not fit his program because it required him to kind of confront the radicalization of parts of the Republican Party, the Trump movement within the Republican Party, in a way that didn't fit with his broader messaging. So and same thing happened, I think, on vaccinations. I mean, he was reluctant to fully acknowledge the extent to which some of these governors were undermining what he was trying to do at the national level. So I think they've been very slow to come to it. The Senate Democrats, I think, were also slow to come to it, but they have come around. I mean, you know, after Joe Manchin blew up very kind of in June, objected to H.R. 1, the principles that he put out, the bill that they've negotiated, while, you know, both of my co-panelists have said is not a silver bullet, I think goes further in the direction of securing voting rights than many would have anticipated when he first wrote that piece in June. And now we are at crunch time because, you know, Chuck Schumer has said to Manchin, all right, all 50 Democrats are here. You go out and find 10 Republicans. Well, he's probably not going to find one Republican, much less 10. And then at some point in the next few weeks, we are going to face when maybe, you know, when the reconciliation has been cleared aside, are the Senate Democrats willing to make any exception, carve out from the filibuster for voting rights? If not, they will in effect be giving Republicans in the Senate a veto over whether the federal government responds to this offensive by Republicans in the states. That's ahistorical. It's very different than what's happening in the states where these bills are passing on a party line basis. But that is the choice. We're coming to crunch time.
Mm-hmm. I wanted you to respond specifically to that notion that you can out-organize voter suppression. Why isn't Georgia in 2020 an example of, a proof point to say, you know, if you sign enough people up, it doesn't matter what tactics are employed?
I mean, it is a proof point, right? That if you invest heavily in Black-led and youth-led and women-led organizations, if you invest in grassroots organizations, if you are recruiting accountable candidates, and that you follow the leadership of organizers and community folks, and that you invest millions of dollars over a decade and register 600,000 Black folks in all 159 of Georgia's counties, then maybe you can get a 0.0025% win in a hotly contested election, right? And then if you have the infrastructure that we had, that if you have a special election, a once in a lifetime, once in a generation, actually unprecedented election where there are not one but two United States Senate seats on the ballot at the same time. One of them running is like a handsome pastor who is literally only the third person to command Martin Luther King's pulpit since he was assassinated. And then a 33-year-old, again, handsome Jewish kid from the North Atlanta suburbs. And a once in a generation terrible candidate at the top of the ticket, or incumbent president. And then the incumbent senators that they were running against, Republican Barbie, who's a terrible person, and WNBA player, and all of her employees endorsed her opponent. right, publicly in every time they showed up to work with Vote Warnock mask, and the sitting senator was the owner of their WNBA team. Like, if those conditions, you can recreate them in every state, then yeah, absolutely, we can out-organize them, right? But the truth of the matter is that those folks, the same people who are saying that, did not invest in our organizing, right? And have no idea the sacrifice. Like, I am here with you all today in person, A, because David Axelrod asked me, but also B, because I have the best lawyers in the Southeastern United States, and I am not in jail, right? Because they seek to do that every day, that I have been under investigation by an entire alphabet soup of federal and state agencies, right? In an attempt to shut down the work that we do, right? That, no, like, that's just not a reality. That is an attempt to deflect, right? To say that, listen, I did not serve 5 decades in the United States Senate, right? I can't whip senators' votes, right? I am a community organizer, and so I can do what I do, but when we elect folks and send them to Atlanta, to the state capitol, or when we send them to Washington, D.C., it's to do your work, not mine, right? I need a president of the United States. I need a leader in the Senate that sees and understands what the priorities are of their party's base and gets to work. Let me tell you, Addison Mitchell McConnell III has not stuttered once. He told you that he's going to do everything in his power to make sure that the Biden-Harris agenda is dead on arrival. So where are these 10 Republicans that you're going to look for? Where are they going to find them? We have to get rid of the filibuster if you are serious about making progress on the Democratic agenda. Otherwise, what are we talking about? Again, as a community organizer, I'm going to make sure that we have nuns in full habits when we have municipal elections, when people go vote for the mayor of Atlanta on November 2nd, that are handing out water with New Georgia Project labels on it, and who are prepared to take arrests, right? We have attorneys, right, who are being trained. Shout out to the Brennan Center and other organizations, because not since the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed have we needed a criminal defense bar that was skilled and knowledgeable about voting laws, right? That now we need criminal defense lawyers who understand these new voting crimes that are being passed in states all over the country. That was not a need before. And so guess what I am doing is going out and recruiting lawyers and finding smart people like Sean to train them, right? So that we are prepared for what happens on the ground. But we need our partners to do their jobs as well, not to deflect in this moment.
My last question, I think we're going to go to audience questions after this. Sean, I wanted to ask about election subversion specifically. Not, we've talked a lot about suppression, we talked about Shelby, but there's also this growing threat, as you mentioned, in 2022, 2024, of officials who are knowingly disregarding the votes of communities. I was in Michigan, where the Republican Party there has totally wiped out a whole group of election supervisors to install folks who, some of whom were literally at the Capitol on January 6th. Yeah. How does our democracy overcome that threat, and how real do you think that threat is?
I think it's a real threat. I think that when we talk about this wave of bills that passed this year, I want to be clear that most of those bills, the bills that were sort of seemingly aimed at giving partisan actors the power to overturn election results, and there were those bills, did not pass. This wasn't a year when we saw a bunch of those kinds of bills passing. That hasn't happened. But we've never seen those things being introduced before. And we've certainly never seen them almost pass. The Texas bill that did pass is different than the one that almost passed back in May before the Democratic members of the Texas House walked out and broke quorum. The bill that almost passed, was hours from passing, contained a provision called Overturning Elections, that was, not the worst of these, but it was a bad one.
I hate that the overturn elections provision wasn't all that bad.
I know, it was called that. It said that right at the top, underlined overturning elections. The sponsors of that bill, the next day after the Democrats walked out and it failed to pass, backed away very quickly from the overturning elections part of it. There were two pieces to that bill. A piece that made it so you couldn't vote on the Sunday morning before Election Day, which was pretty clearly targeted at Souls to the Polls efforts, and this overturning elections provision that all of a sudden the next day were accidents. When the bill didn't pass, the sponsor said this was the early Sunday morning thing was a typo. The other one, I don't know where that came from. We never would have been okay with that, even though I voted for it yesterday. And so they're clearly not there yet. These bills don't have the support. They weren't able to pass this year, but we should all be very concerned about the fact that they were close, that they were being introduced. But I do want to say that, and we should be concerned about people who are running to run our elections who actively support this idea that last year's election was rigged. The heroes of last year's election were certainly the organizers, the people getting the voters to turn out, but the heroes of the last election also include the election officials that run our elections, that ran our elections during a pandemic, when their staff were subjected to a pandemic and putting their lives on the line. And then they faced this year this backlash of violent threats of people standing outside their offices with guns, and then state legislature passing laws that criminalize them doing what they need to do to help voters. And they are quitting, they are retiring, they don't want to do this job anymore because it doesn't pay that well and it's scary. And now you have people who are trying to fill those spots who were supporters of the idea that the last year's election was rigged. These are definitely things we should be scared of. But I also think we shouldn't separate those things from all the other bills we're talking about. These are all of a piece. They are all about subverting elections. They're all about trying to undermine our democracy, trying to make it so that the people who have a majority of the votes don't win the election. Suppressing the vote or overturning counts or whatever it is, whatever that tactic is, it's all the same thing. So I don't want to treat them like they're entirely different animals. I think all of these pieces fit together, and for years it has been about layering another level of suppression, a new set of rules on top of the last one, so that when folks come out and do out-organize with all of the resources that NSA is talking about, unprecedented resources and a bizarre confluence of political circumstances, then you pass Senate Bill 202 the next year and you put a new layer on top of it, so now they have to overcome that set of hurdles, and you figure out exactly where they were successful last time around with 24-hour voting and drive-through voting, and you pass a bill in Texas that says they can't do that. These are all the same thing. It is all about trying to stop the people who you don't want voting from voting, and or to keep their votes from counting, to throw out their ballots after the fact, whatever you can do. So I think we should be scared of it, but I don't think we should act like the thing that hasn't happened yet is the thing we have to be scared of in the future. It's happening right now. It may not be those bills, but it's these other bills, and we need to be fighting back against it right now. And just to add something onto what Nsé said about this idea of out-organizing, I think, at the grand scale that she's talking about it, like, can some voter engagement, GOTV effort overcome all of the hurdles that's placed in front of them? Maybe they can with all of the resources and all the right circumstances. But that's like saying that, can a voter wait online for 10 hours and then vote? Yes, they can. But that doesn't make it okay that we make them do that, right? It's not okay that someone has to wait 10 hours to vote. The fact that they care enough to do it in the end doesn't make it okay that they had to do it, nor should we be okay with the fact that it takes millions and millions of dollars and just unprecedented efforts to overcome the hurdles that are placed in front of voters to let people actually exercise their right to vote. That's not how this is supposed to work, and we shouldn't be okay with that. And the White House should not be okay with that. The White House should be doing what they can do, and they have tremendous power to do something about this. With 2 bills pending in Congress, they should do what they can do to set aside a rule that is an undemocratic, anti-democratic rule that has historically been used to get in the way of voting rights, to get in the way of civil rights, and not let that be the thing that gets in the way of the opportunity to finally fix these problems. So I think it is absolutely frustrating to those of us who spend our careers trying to help people vote to have the president or someone speaking on behalf of the president say, well, we'll just out-organize all this stuff that's happening.
Ested, can I just add one quick thing before we go to the audience?
Yes.
I remember thinking when Biden came out in favor of same-sex marriage that Obama was going to be the last Democratic president ever who didn't support it. It turned out, he was for only part of the time. I think the same thing is true here now. I think Biden is the last Democratic president, last person who will get nominated for president by the Democrats, who will not explicitly support rolling back or eliminating the filibuster. And I think it is possible that Manchin and Sinema will be the last two Democratic senators who will not support rolling back or eliminating the filibusters, because the cost of it is just too the will in a such a polarized era when it is highly unlikely to get 10 votes or 8 votes or whatever you would need from the other party. The idea of giving the minority party a veto over the majority agenda is just, I think, unsustainable, and especially when you consider that the things that Republicans care the most about, cutting taxes and appointing judges, including justices, they can do with majority vote. So I think this may be once the window closes, it may be a while till Democrats can have a unified control of a trifecta again. Neither party has been able to sustain it very long in the modern era, but I do think Biden is the last president who will not support rolling back the filibuster.
Yeah. The question is, what the stakes of this window, right?
Yeah.
And what might be cost for even in that. We want to open it up to questions. I believe that is happening over there. As we mentioned earlier, we are trying to prioritize students. We would love alternating and making sure we have voices cross-gender and also. So let's do it. That's it.
Hello. My name is Cassandra Crevecoeur. I'm a student of the college. I'm majoring in public policy and creative writing. And it was mentioned that there's always an organization effort against backlash laws. I was wondering, due to the continuous changes of rhetoric, do you think it's possible to prevent the creation of these kinds of laws when laws are initially crafted? And do you think it's wise to try?
You're saying that is there a way to preemptively stop these laws before rather than organize after they are passed?
Yes, there is. It was written into the Voting Rights Act in 1965. It's called Section 5, and it says that we've seen you doing this for all of these decades, trying to make it harder for black people to vote. So from now on, before you change your voting rules, you have to come check with us first. That's what preclearance is. All of these states that had been doing this forever had to now, every time they changed not just a voting law, but a policy, a practice, they changed the way their elections work, they had to go get those changes pre-cleared by the Department of Justice or by a federal court, and they had to prove that the thing they were doing wasn't going to create discriminatory results. And if they couldn't, then they couldn't change the rules. And that was the most powerful remedy for civil rights violations that our nation has ever had on the books, and it worked for decades, and then the Supreme Court threw it out in 2013. They said, yes, you can still have preclearance, but the formula that you've decided to use to decide who gets covered by preclearance, we're not convinced that you had a good enough record of race discrimination to support that. We're not so sure race discrimination is the problem that it once was. So Congress, you have to go back to the drawing board and fix that. And the thing is, this wasn't the first time this happened. In 1965, Congress faced a crisis. It was a crisis that obviously had existed basically for the entire history of our nation. But in 1965, when people started dying in Selma, we realized it was a crisis. Congress responded. They passed a law. They fixed it. In 1982, after the Supreme Court interpreted the Voting Rights Act in a way that was not the way that Congress intended it, Congress responded, and they passed the 1982 amendments to the Voting Rights Act and fixed that mistake by the Supreme Court. And then, decades later, the Supreme Court deals a blow in 2013 by getting rid of preclearance, And then again, just a few months ago in 2021, deals another blow to the Voting Rights Act. And the question is, will Congress respond again and do what it has done before and put preclearance back into effect? And that is what we've talked about, H.R. 1 a fair amount, the Before the People Act, which now the compromise version is the Freedom to Vote Act. But the other one, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, would put preclearance back on the books. So all of these would create two new formulas for who has to go through preclearance. Preclearance is still there. If that happened, then every time one of these states wanted to try to do one of these things, they would have to first go prove to a federal court or to the Department of Justice that what they're doing wasn't going to create discriminatory results. And if they can't, then it won't go on the books. So it's a great question, it's a genius idea, and it's one that we thought of a long time ago, and the Supreme Court got rid of it, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Pietro Uvara, and I'm a first-year student at the college here, and I'm hoping to eventually major in law, but at the moment I'm undecided. So you all, but in particular Ron, talked a lot about how the Republican Party was rapidly losing power in the face of demographic change, and that's what kind of prompted them to turn to a lot of voter restriction rights. And so my question's a bit two-pronged in the sense that, do you all believe that the Republican Party will push this constriction of rights indefinitely? Or do you think that there will come a point with the results of demographic change leading to them having such a minority that they can't continue to kind of use these tactics anymore? In which case, what will the Republican Party of the future look like to you all?
Yeah, Ron, you want to take that one? I mean, you mentioned in your response, I remember, it's not as if Republicans had totally bleak results among people of color in 2020, but yet we have seen this reaction. How do we square what is clearly a focus for them with the reality of the electoral map?
Yeah. So, look, the turning point in many ways was after the 2012 election. Republicans, came out after Obama won, and there was the discussion of the autopsy,
yes,
which said that the party had to do better among young voters and people of color. And the manifestation of that was, let's pass immigration reform. And they got it through the Senate with, I think, 13 Republican senators voting for it, which was down already from 2006. And then the House Republicans would not consider it at all. And a counter view developed, a series of articles on the website Real Clear Politics by Sean Trendy, arguing that the path forward for Republicans was not necessarily to improve among voters of color, it was to increase turnout and share among the more culturally conservative white voters who were drawn to them, particularly non-college, non-urban and evangelical whites. And then Trump becomes Santorum, was kind of an early, and Huckabee in 08, Santorum in 12 were kind of versions of that. And then Trump kind of takes this and it becomes kind of the strategy. And I believe that the efforts to restrict access to the vote is fundamentally based on the idea of maintaining power with a preponderantly white coalition, even as those groups that are central to the coalition are shrinking as a share of the society. Non-college whites, 2 points every 4 years, less share of the vote. Evangelical whites down to, or actually white Christians now down to just a little over 40% of the overall population. In 2020, Trump was discovered or showed that through intense targeting of culturally conservative non-white voters, he was able to make some gains, in fact, particularly among Hispanic men, maybe in some places among black men. And this was kind of a bonus that this, not only the kind of restrictive attitude toward the vote, but kind of open xenophobia, go back, kids in cages, separating parents from kids, was not a disqualifying hurdle with some minority voters, particularly men. I mean, I think the gender gap was really big among both African American and Latino voters. But look, I think that Republicans believe they can, have a two-track strategy. I think the central strategy is to make it harder for young people of color in particular to vote, because they see most of those as Democratic voters. But the 2020 showed that did not preclude their ability to kind of make inroads at the margins. And I think you probably are going to see both pieces. But I don't think that Trump's gains among Hispanic and Black voters, which still left Democrats with about 60% of Hispanics and roughly 90% of Black voters, if I'm remembering the various exit polls. I don't think that those gains were enough to convince enough Republicans that they can kind of open the doors to this new generation participating. And I think on balance, as they are showing in state after state, their impulse is still restrictionary.
Mm-hmm. I would also only add quickly that we should also not think of race as a fixed definition too, right? That what it means to be white and non-white can also change.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Hannah Dominguez, and I'm a third year at the college studying political science. My question, because I'm from Northern Atlanta, is actually specific to tonight's discussion about Georgian politics. The kind of idea that I got from tonight's discussion was that because the odds were so stacked against Loeffler and Trump in the past elections, that is the reason for these exceptional results that we've seen. But myself and many of my family members and friends have taken these results as a sign of hope for Georgia's future to become more liberal and or progressive. I wanted to know, do you guys think that this was actually a fluke and could not be recreated within the next elections that we see for governor, senator, and eventually for president? Or is there more that needs to be done regarding organizing and legislation?
Me. Can I?
Yeah, but who should we go to on this one?
Yeah. I'd argue that the results that we saw in 2020 and 2021, we should have seen a decade ago in Georgia, that it is because of this sort of sophisticated scheme of voter suppression laws and like the aggressive sort of leveraging of their platform. So you need to know that voter registration fraud, which they routinely accuse us of, carries with it a penalty of up to 10 years in prison and $100,000 in fines per form. And my organization has registered almost 600,000 young people and people of color in all 159 of Georgia's counties. So you can imagine that if they are successful, I mean, they won't be, knock on wood, right? But if they're successful, it would bankrupt us.
It's only like $600 billion in fines.
Math is hard. But yes, exactly. It would bankrupt us, right? But again, I absolutely take it as a sign of hope that for the first time in a long time in Georgia, that we were able to make sure that the will of the people was actually reflected in the results of our elections. And that I'd argue that the will of the people has been where the 2021 results are for quite some time, but we haven't been able to have it reflected in our election results because of the long-standing attacks on the franchise and the right to vote. Because what I will argue is that many people, we've talked a lot about Shelby versus Holder, which is this trash Supreme Court decision that happened in 2013. But the Georgia legislature passed its voter ID law 6 years before that, in 2007, right? And it passed pre-clearance, right? So it's been a long-standing effort to try to get the people's will out and to get their Republican thumb off of the scale. So you should be encouraged. This is our time. We will continue to organize. We will continue to double down. You're not crazy. You should be excited about it. But what it also means is that, that we won. And then we have to defend those wins beyond one election cycle, which means that we have to continue to organize.
In the same way that, unique conditions helped Democrats in 2020, Donald Trump also has unique advantages too. And the Republican Party will, at least politically and electorally, need to create things that he was able to do. And so that is also something that Democrats and Republicans will have a challenge on.
Thank you.
Welcome. I think we have time for, if I read this correctly, 3 more questions.
Hello, I am Luke Walker. I'm a first year here, a member of the class of 2025 here at the college. And so I was a poll worker in a rural county this election. And I was just curious for you guys, especially a community organizer, if you were aware of any strategies that, some of us here from rural communities could bring to our homes to sort of educate the community, especially with, the fake ideas of voter fraud, and to sort of, bring more awareness to rural areas, because I think we all know how important areas like Atlanta and Philadelphia were in this election. But I was just curious, any ideas on how we could sort of help educate the more rural areas of this country?
Well, I would say, yes, we ran up the score in Atlanta, and that's important. But if Georgia is one of America's newest battleground states, it was one in the battleground counties in our state, which is what we call Georgia's rural black belt. So imagine like a prom sash, right, going from like northeast Georgia across the state diagonally to southwest Georgia. That these are about 25 counties that are majority African American or a plurality of people of color, but mostly rural, right? And so I think that one, we got to start telling the truth about rural America, right? That oftentimes people use rural as code for white conservative, but the truth of the matter is that not only are there white progressives and white moderates there, but it's a bunch of black folks and Latinos and Asian Americans and people of color as well, right? So there's number one. I think number two, there are no safe seats. I think it's time to start challenging assumptions, right? That we running people all over the state, right? Including in, red counties and in red cities. It's so funny, every time I think that we're done like having first, like the first woman, the first black person, like there's just more opportunities to have first. And so I think that, one, throw conventional wisdom out of the window, right? That you are trying to do something that appears like it hasn't been done in a while, meeting people where they are. And I'll tell you this, and I'll stop. The way that we train our organizers is that you have twice as many ears as you do mouths, right? And so you should be listening to people, and folks will tell you what their hopes are and what their fears are for themselves, for their families, for their communities, right? And that we work to connect the power of the vote, the act of the vote, to the thing that people told us that they care about, the change that they told us they absolutely want to see, or the thing that they can't stand to see continue, right? And so listen, because folks will, listen, you come with a relevant message, right? You come with the truth about the power of the vote and how it will impact the things that they care about. And then you start from there, right? But we don't lie to the people, ever. So we don't frame voting as a magic, like silver bullet, but we talk about, in very plain and very practical terms, about the power of the vote. And again, because we're listening, the change that people told us in that community, they want to see.
Thank you.
Thank you guys all so very much.
Thank you for being a poll worker.
Yeah,
For sure.
Yeah.
Hello, my name is Angeliki. I am a student in the college. So I'm from Indiana, a place that has kind of recently been known for purging voter rolls, and has been doing so for many years. And looking at Indiana voter suppression, to me, a lot of it seems to come down to one or two people, like the Secretary of State or some county official or a poll worker or something like that. And it's not necessarily always about the laws that are being passed. It's someone's subjective judgment of whether or not a vote counts. And if you're in a county of 500 people, well, your vote counts a lot. So I was wondering, what are your thoughts on kind of that, and especially when it regards to local and state elections? How do we kind of address this imbalance of power, I would say?
Sean?
Sure. So first I'll say, in Indiana, I think you're right that election officials play a huge role, but I will also say that we have, at the Brennan Center, sued Indiana over a law that the legislature passed to make it way easier to purge voters off the rolls, and have repeatedly won. They keep appealing it and changing the law and appealing it, but we have been successful in stopping that law from going on the books. But they have, you're absolutely right to point to the power of elections officials, which can be, which usually I would say is wielded for good. Most elections officials of both parties and nonpartisan, and it sort of depends on where you're in the country, how they work, really are trying to do their best to make elections work and help people vote. There are, times when they're not, and because our elections are because of the way our system works, local elections officials have a lot of power over local elections. We have this system where people in counties actually run elections across the country more than anybody else. It can really matter if you've got someone that isn't playing that role. I think that's one reason, as Nsé was talking about, people should be voting based on the things that they can actually accomplish in their lives, and you need to tie it to those things. I think local elections officials, when they are elected, that's a race that matters a whole lot, and people aren't paying attention to it. Just like people talk about, when you're electing your DAs, or here in Illinois, your state's attorney, or judges. I think election officials are a thing that people don't pay any attention to. The state of Illinois is about to have a change in Secretary of State for the first time that I can remember, and people in Illinois, the Secretary of State isn't an election official, but in most states, the Secretary of State's an election official. People aren't paying attention to that election there any more than they are here, and the same for their local election officials. You need to, people should really be engaged in those elections, and then they should be engaged with those officials after the fact. They should be signing up to be poll workers. They should be paying attention to the decisions that their local election officials are making and holding them accountable. Without pre-clearance, those local election officials can make a lot of changes without anybody noticing. And in a place like Atlanta, there's a lot of people paying attention to what the elections officials are doing. But in a lot of small counties, no one's paying that much attention. There was actually in Georgia, I remember in 2018, a whole bunch of smaller counties were closing polling places. And there were a lot of people paying attention in those local boards of elections meetings to see that this was happening. But that kind of thing can go under the radar in a lot of places in this country. And it really does require us to view it as a democracy. Go pay attention to what your local board of elections is doing, to what your county elections administrator is doing. Unfortunately, that takes a lot of work, and the way these systems work is different in every part of the country. As I said, like in Illinois, the Secretary of State's not the election official. In Indiana, you have boards. In other counties, in other parts of the country, you just have one county election official. It can be a tough work, but it's important. It's good that you're already paying attention to it. And I'll also say that is why it is so important that we pass something like the Freedom to Vote Act, which establishes a baseline across the country. It's good for elections officials to have discretion to change things when they need to, if there's a natural disaster, if there's a pandemic, to change things in order to be more friendly to voters and give them the opportunity. But they shouldn't have the discretion to do all kinds of anti-voter things. And that's why it's important that we set a floor across the country for what elections look like, so that this variation from county to county can't be the thing that determines whether or not your vote counts.
We have time for one more. This also brings me to my most firmly held political opinion, which is that Georgia has too many counties.
100%. I completely agree with you. Georgia has the second highest number of counties in any state in the country, second only to Texas. And there's more people in Texas. There's the same number of people in Texas that live in Canada, right? So
as an Illinois school child, I was always told we have more individual units of government than any other state in the country here in Illinois.
That's hilarious.
Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Elizabeth Snyder, and I'm a first year in the college. And my question is that given that some moderate Democrats don't want to abolish the filibuster, what do you think is the most important next step for voting rights?
Ron, you wanna end us off here? Is there a remedy that does not require filibuster elimination?
No. I think that look, I mean, I
Tell
think
the truth.
this is an historic, I say no. Here's the reality. This Supreme Court majority is not going to constrain what the states are doing in any meaningful way. In the red states themselves, by definition, Democrats don't have the votes to stop. They can apply public pressure and, as Sean was talking about, kind of sand down some of the sharpest edges of these proposals, but they fundamentally, as the Texas example showed, they can't stop them. The one lever they have is they have this moment of unified control of government. And it is worth noting that the last 4 times a president went into the midterm with unified control of government, voters have revoked it. That was Trump in 18, Obama 10, Bush 6, Clinton 94. So it is a brief window where they have the opportunity to pass legislation that would set a national floor of voting rights. And the position that Manchin and Sinema are taking is contrary to both current experience and historical experience. current experience in the sense that their basic position is that the Senate should act only if Republicans agree to do so. In effect, giving a veto to the Republicans on whether there is any response to what's happening in the states. Well, I worked, Sean, with some of your colleagues, as you may recall, this spring on a piece looking at the passage of these laws in the states, and you guys calculated the numbers. They are passing on a complete party line basis in state after state after state. There are essentially no Democrats voting for any of these voter suppression laws, and no Republicans voting, very few, tiny numbers of Republicans voting against them. Then if you look historically, and we referenced the 14th and 15th Amendments before, by the Manchin-Sinema standard, neither of those would have been approved, because no Democrats in either chamber voted for either of them, because at that point, the only Democrats left in Congress were still allied with the white Southern former Confederates who were doing everything they could to prevent the freed slaves from exercising any civil or voting rights. So no, I don't think there is any plan B. I mean, I think that essentially the issue is whether Manchin and Sinema are going to give Republicans in the Senate a veto over whether the federal government responds to what Republicans in the states are doing. And, they are not going to approve a broad retrenchment of the filibuster. And the hope is that they will accept some sort of carve-out for voting rights legislation, and I don't think any of us knows whether they will do that. They've given no indication that they will, except there are those who are at least optimistic that Manchin would not have gone this far down the road of drafting his own bill, working with Democrats to kind of reach a compromise on that, simply to allow Republicans to kill it. So we'll see. Anyway, by the way, thanks for letting me be part of this again from the road. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ron. Stead, our great panelists. Let's give them all a big hand. Again, just a wonderful way to come back together after these months, and it's just the beginning. And I just wanted to urge everyone to keep your eye on our website at politics.uchicago.edu. We have an incredible array of fellows and the seminars began today for students. Really encourage you to take advantage of those. We've got some wonderful events coming up. I just mentioned a few at the beginning of tonight. We've got civic engagement programs that are exciting, UCHI Votes being one of them, but many, many more. We've got internship programs and career counseling. There's a lot going on at the IOP, and now you can share them not over Zoom. So I urge you to take advantage of them. I hope we see you all again next week and the week after and the week after. Thanks again to all of you for kicking off this year. What a great way to start. Thank you.